There are moments in the history of the Church when a single sentence seems to divide an entire age. Not because it creates a crisis, but because it reveals one that already exists. A few days ago, a statement made years earlier by Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò began circulating once again among Catholics around the world. Some dismissed it immediately, others read it with discomfort, and still others read it and felt something very different: recognition. Because the words seemed to describe precisely what they had been experiencing for years. The statement was simple: we must not allow ourselves to be driven out of the Church of which we are legitimate children. Not driven out by persecution from governments, not driven out by atheistic regimes, not driven out by enemies outside the gates, driven out by the feeling that fidelity itself has become suspicious. By the end of this video, you will understand why this appeal has resurfaced now, why so many faithful Catholics identify with it, and why the answer proposed by Archbishop Viganò is not new at all. In fact, it is centuries old. To understand why, we need to begin with a man who lived more than 300 years ago. A priest, a missionary, a mystic, a saint. His name was Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort. Montfort lived in an age of turmoil. France was changing, faith was weakening, intellectual movements were spreading rapidly through Europe. Many priests had become comfortable, many believers had become indifferent. And yet Montfort spent very little time worrying about political developments. His attention was focused elsewhere. He was interested in souls. And above all, he was interested in one particular mystery: the role of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the final triumph of Christ. In his writings, Montfort describes a future period of extraordinary conflict, a time when confusion would spread, a time when error would become powerful, a time when many would lose courage. And yet he insisted that God would raise up faithful souls prepared specifically for that moment. Not necessarily bishops, not necessarily theologians, not necessarily famous people. Ordinary Catholics, men and women hidden from the world, people whose strength would not come from influence, it would come from consecration. This idea runs throughout his spirituality. The great battles of history are not won first in parliaments. They are won in hearts, not by armies, by saints, not by public power, by private holiness. For many years, these passages remained largely devotional texts, beautiful, inspiring, but distant. Then came the 20th century. 2 world wars, totalitarian governments, mass persecution, the sexual revolution, the collapse of religious practice across much of the West, the emergence of a culture increasingly detached from Christianity. Suddenly, many Catholics began rereading Montfort, not as poetry, but as prophecy, because the struggles he described no longer seemed theoretical, they seemed visible. And this is where the story becomes more interesting, because in recent weeks, another voice entered the conversation. Not a saint from the 18th century, a contemporary archbishop, a controversial figure, a man whose statements often provoke strong reactions. Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò. Love him or criticize him, there is one fact nobody disputes. His words attract attention. And recently, Catholic commentator John Henry Weston publicly revisited one of Viganò's most passionate appeals. Not because it was new, but because he believed it had become newly relevant. The appeal centered on a simple conviction: that faithful Catholics must not abandon the Church even when they feel misunderstood inside it. That sentence may seem obvious, but in the present climate it carries enormous weight, because many believers today experience a tension their grandparents never faced. They attend Mass, they pray the Rosary, they teach their children the faith, they follow traditional devotions, and yet they often feel as though these practices are regarded with suspicion. Not everywhere, not by everyone, but frequently enough that the feeling has become familiar. This is the experience Viganò was addressing. Not the question of whether the Church is true, not the question of whether Christ remains Lord, but the question of what a faithful Catholic should do when he feels unwelcome in his own spiritual home. His answer was immediate. Do not leave. Do not surrender. Do not allow yourself to be pushed out. Remain. Fight spiritually. Remain faithful. Remain Catholic. And perhaps the most striking element of the appeal was the image he used. The little ones, those hidden souls consecrated to the Immaculate Heart, those who possess no institutional power, no media influence, no political leverage, only prayer, only fidelity, only perseverance. For Catholics familiar with Montfort's writings, the parallel was impossible to miss. The language was different, the century was different, the circumstances were different, but the vision appeared remarkably similar, a remnant not defined by prestige, a remnant defined by faithfulness. And this raises a question. Why does this message resonate so strongly right now? The answer is not difficult to find. Because many Catholics feel exhausted. Not exhausted by persecution from the world, the Church has always faced that, but exhausted by confusion. One document says one thing, another appears to suggest something different. One bishop emphasizes clarity, another emphasizes adaptation. One parish preserves ancient practices, another seems eager to reinvent them. Ordinary believers find themselves navigating debates they never expected to encounter. Questions about doctrine, questions about liturgy, questions about authority, questions about identity. And in the middle of all this, many simply want to know where they belong. That is why appeals like Viganò's receive attention, not because everyone agrees with every conclusion, but because they address a real emotional reality. The feeling of displacement, the feeling that something familiar has become uncertain. Yet this is where we must be careful, because the history of the Church contains many crises, and every crisis creates temptations. One temptation is despair, another is anger, a third is withdrawal. History shows that none of these paths produce renewal. The saints almost always chose a different route. They remained. Saint Athanasius remained. Saint Catherine of Siena remained. Saint Teresa of Avila remained. Saint Pius X remained. They criticized errors when necessary. They defended truth when necessary. But they never abandoned the Church. This point is crucial, because Viganò's appeal is often misunderstood. Many assume it is fundamentally about opposition. It is not. At its core, it is about endurance. The conviction that fidelity matters even when it appears ineffective, that prayer matters even when results seem invisible, that truth matters even when it becomes unpopular. This conviction explains why the appeal focuses so heavily on Marian devotion, the Rosary, consecration, the scapular, the first Saturdays. To many modern observers, these practices seem small, even insignificant. Yet throughout Catholic history, they have been treated as powerful precisely because they are small. The logic is profoundly Christian. God repeatedly chooses what appears weak: a shepherd against a giant, fishermen against empires, a young woman from Nazareth against the powers of darkness. The pattern never changes. And according to Montfort, it would not change in the future either. The final victories would belong not to the powerful, but to the faithful, not to those who dominate headlines, but to those who persevere. This is why his writings continue to attract attention 3 centuries later, because they offer something modern culture rarely provides: hope without illusion. Hope that does not depend on circumstances. Hope that survives confusion. Hope that survives disappointment. Hope that survives crisis. And perhaps that is why John Henry Weston chose to revisit Viganò's words now, because many Catholics are asking the same question. What are we supposed to do? What happens if the confusion continues? What happens if the divisions deepen? What happens if the future becomes even more uncertain? The answer given by Montfort was simple: become saints. The answer given by Viganò was similar: remain faithful. The answer offered by generations of Catholics throughout history has never been very different. Pray, persevere, remain close to Christ, remain close to His Mother, and never surrender the faith you have received. Because crises pass, pontificates pass, movements pass, controversies pass. But Christ remains, the Church remains, and the truth remains. The story, however, does not end there, because another voice, equally influential, addressed this same question decades ago. A bishop who understood media better than almost anyone of his generation. A man who warned that the greatest battles of the future would not be fought primarily in politics or economics. They would be fought over truth itself. And what he said may be even more relevant today than when he first said it. That is where our story continues. The bishop I mentioned at the end of the previous part was Fulton Sheen. Few Catholics of the 20th century understood the spiritual crisis of modern civilization as clearly as he did. Long before social media, long before digital propaganda, long before algorithms shaped public opinion, Sheen warned that confusion would become one of the greatest weapons used against souls. Not necessarily persecution, not necessarily violence, confusion. The inability to distinguish truth from error. The inability to recognize the voice of Christ amid countless competing voices. And perhaps his most famous observation remains one of the most unsettling. He said that in the final confrontation, the battle would not be between the Church and the world. It would be between the Church and the anti-Church, between the gospel and a counterfeit gospel, between Christianity and something that resembles Christianity while quietly removing its supernatural core. Whether one interprets those words broadly or narrowly, they continue to provoke reflection, because they force us to ask a difficult question. What happens when confusion enters places where clarity should reign? What happens when ordinary Catholics feel less certain than previous generations about what is expected of them? And most importantly, how should they respond? This is where the message of Montfort, Viganò, and Sheen begins to converge. Not in politics, not in strategy, not even in analysis, but in spiritual action. The temptation during every crisis is to become obsessed with events. Every statement, every controversy, every headline, every debate, every conflict. And certainly some of these events matter. The history of the Church is not irrelevant. What bishops say matters. What pastors teach matters. What documents contain matters. But there is a danger. The danger of allowing concern for the Church to replace life in the Church. The danger of becoming spectators instead of disciples. The danger of spending so much time watching the battle that we forget to fight it ourselves. This is precisely why the saints repeatedly redirect attention toward the same things: prayer, sacrifice, confession, the Eucharist, the Rosary, faithfulness to daily duties, not because these things are small, but because they are decisive. History repeatedly confirms this. Consider the early Christians. They had no political influence, no media, no legal protections, no powerful institutions. The Roman Empire considered them insignificant. Yet within a few centuries, the empire itself had changed. How? Not through power, through holiness. Or consider the great crises of later centuries: the Protestant Reformation, the French Revolution, the anti-clerical persecutions of the 19th century, the communist regimes of the 20th century. In each case, the Church survived because ordinary believers remained faithful. Not because every bishop was courageous, not because every leader was wise, but because grace continued working through countless hidden souls. This is why Viganò's appeal emphasizes the little ones. The phrase sounds simple, yet it contains an entire theology. God works through those the world overlooks. The saints understood this instinctively. The devil seeks visibility. God often works through obscurity. The world celebrates influence. God often chooses fidelity. The world measures success through numbers. God measures success through faithfulness. And that distinction changes everything, because it means that the future of the Church does not ultimately depend on any single personality. Not on a pope, not on a cardinal, not on a bishop, not on a journalist, not on a commentator. The future of the Church depends on Christ, and Christ remains active in His Church regardless of circumstances. That truth sounds obvious, yet during periods of crisis, it becomes difficult to remember. Especially when emotions run high, especially when controversies multiply, especially when uncertainty grows. This is why so many spiritual writers insist on remaining rooted in what does not change. The creed does not change. The sacraments do not change. The gospel does not change. Christ does not change. And the Blessed Virgin Mary does not cease being the mother of the faithful. Everything else may fluctuate. These remain. This perspective also explains something important about the saints. They rarely spent their lives predicting catastrophe. Instead, they prepared souls. Montfort did not merely describe future battles, he taught people how to live. Sheen did not merely diagnose problems, he called people to holiness. Even Viganò's appeal, despite its strong language, ultimately points towards spiritual perseverance rather than resignation. The central message remains remarkably consistent. Do not abandon the Church. Do not surrender your faith. Do not allow confusion to become an excuse for discouragement. Remain where Christ placed you. Remain faithful. Remain Catholic. That may sound simple, but simplicity is often more demanding than complexity. Anyone can become angry. Anyone can become cynical. Anyone can become discouraged. Faithfulness requires something deeper: patience, humility, perseverance, trust. These virtues are difficult precisely because they endure. And this brings us back to St. Louis de Montfort. Why did he ask God for the grace to live in an age of crisis? Why would anyone desire such a thing? The answer reveals something profound about Christian spirituality. Because saints do not seek comfortable times. They seek opportunities to love God. And opportunities to love God often appear most clearly during difficult periods, when faith costs something, when fidelity requires courage, when remaining Catholic is no longer socially convenient. Montfort believed that the greatest victories belong to those who remain faithful during the hardest battles. Not because suffering is desirable, but because love becomes visible when tested. This is the lesson repeated throughout Christian history. The martyrs did not choose their circumstances, they chose fidelity. The confessors did not choose their trials, they chose fidelity. The saints did not choose their crises, they chose fidelity. That is why their witness continues inspiring believers centuries later, not because they solved every problem, but because they remained faithful despite them. And perhaps this is the most important point of all. The Church has always passed through storms. Some lasted decades, some lasted centuries, some appeared overwhelming. Yet every storm eventually passed. The Church emerged wounded at times, purified at times, humbled at times, but never destroyed. Because the promise of Christ remains, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That promise does not eliminate suffering. It does not eliminate confusion. It does not eliminate conflict. What it eliminates is despair. Despair assumes the story is over. Faith knows the story belongs to God. This is why Catholics throughout history have repeatedly returned to the same source of confidence. Not optimism, not politics, not human institutions. Christ. The same Christ worshipped by the apostles, the same Christ adored by the martyrs, the same Christ preached by the saints, The same Christ who remains present in the Blessed Sacrament. Everything ultimately returns to him. And this is why the practical response proposed by so many spiritual writers remains remarkably similar. Attend Mass faithfully. Go to confession regularly. Pray the Rosary. Read Scripture. Study the faith. Practice charity. Consecrate yourself to Our Lady. Remain close to Christ. These recommendations may appear ordinary, but Christianity has always transformed the world through ordinary faithfulness, not through extraordinary publicity. The future will undoubtedly bring new challenges, new controversies, new debates, new uncertainties. But the answer will remain what it has always been: holiness. Not theoretical holiness, practical holiness, daily holiness. The kind built through prayer when no one is watching, the kind built through sacrifice when no one notices, the kind built through fidelity when no one applauds. That is the path Montfort described. That is the path countless saints walked, and that is the path still open today. The final lesson from all of this is surprisingly hopeful. You are not the first generation to face confusion. You are not the first generation to experience uncertainty. You are not the first generation to wonder what comes next. Others walked this road before you. Others remained faithful before you. Others trusted Christ before you. And because they did, the faith reached you. Now the responsibility passes to us, not to invent a new faith, not to create a new gospel, but to preserve what we have received, to live it, to transmit it, to love it, and to trust that God remains at work even when His plans are not immediately visible. The saints understood this, Montfort understood it, Sheen understood it, and perhaps that is why their words continue resonating today, because every generation eventually discovers the same truth. The Church belongs to Christ, the victory belongs to Christ, and those who remain faithful to Him will never be abandoned. What do you think? If you appreciate this work and would like to support the channel, you can subscribe and help us continue producing content about faith, history, and the life of the Church. Thank you very much for your support. If you enjoyed this video, comment Amen. God bless you.